And tonight we'll be joined by Senior Librarian Timothy Pwee, who traced the founding and development of Singapore's natural history societies from European expatriates to local Singaporeans, as well as their activities through the decades. Timothy has been with the National Library since the 90s. He was with the Science and Technology Collection Group, but now focuses on Singapore history and society. He's interested in Singapore's social world as well as Singapore's journey from agriculture and trade to industrialization. So ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Timothy Pwee.
Good evening. Well, basically, I would have to preface this is that basically what I'm looking at is our collection. There's a whole lot of other material out there which is not yet in our collection, but hopefully will be donated. So what we have is some of the materials, which also includes things like research papers and so on. And after we were generously given the minutes and other materials from the Nature Society by the Society itself, I went online and looked at some of the old papers. Some I knew already, Daniel Goh, Terence, Simon Tay, and so on. They've written about the Society as part of Singapore's civil society. So these are some of the papers downloaded off JSTOR, one of the academic databases that we subscribe to. And basically, looking at it, they all seem to think that civil society sort of like started somehow in the 80s and with things like the women's issues and so on and so forth, and that there was nothing before that. So you have a colonial era, and then you basically end up suddenly with civil society starting in the 80s and so on. But I think that's because it's based on an idea that civil society is sort of like antagonistic. You can only look at it in terms of the public fight between the government and civil society and so on. There's tensions. But actually, I think one of the things that is about civil society and civil society organizations is that actually there's a lot of day-to-day work which goes on behind the scene, meetings with government officials and so on, and negotiations, discussions, and input. They're invited to inputs and so on, which don't actually appear in the press. So these are the sort of things that actually take up most of the time of civil society organizations. Okay, so but first, before I start, I think a bit of background about natural history societies, in that the roots of natural history societies, it goes back to the foundation of, I suppose, as learned societies, the idea of the the Greek academies and so on, places of learning, of discussion and debate. Of course, one of those roots would all end up becoming the university and so on and so forth. But the other part was also societies where you could debate and argue and then learn from each other. So these were the learned societies that especially had its heyday. They started with the Renaissance, and so these societies, got a few. The oldest one would be the Royal Society of London to improve natural knowledge. Then more directly would be, of course, Carl Linnaeus, who actually, how many of you know the binomial system of naming plants and animals? So he started that. He basically started systematics and taxonomy, and his collection of books and materials were actually brought back by Sir James Edward Smith to London, and he founded the Linnean Society there. So basically, the Linnean Society of London would have the sort of the materials and so on from Carl Linnaeus. That's how they got their start. They actually started publishing the Transactions of the Linnean Society, a journal that comes in even today. So we see that because it's a learned society, they read papers, they discuss and so on. And the next part, of course, is that they almost immediately start to publish. So the journal, the magazines and so on is very much a part of these, a characteristic of these societies. A bit after this would come things like the Royal Asiatic Society of London and Ireland, and then also the forming from that in the 1883 would come the Bombay Natural History Society, okay, which exists even today. In fact, over there, the book on Lokwanto's birds actually is published by the Bombay Society. So what we have here is basically a world that in the 19th century was becoming educated, public education and so on was getting, and as people got educated, they started joining these societies, and it was, I suppose, the mark of a learned gentleman rather than a person who just got rich. For the region itself, one of the earliest would be the Batavian Society for Arts and Sciences in what is today's Jakarta. So they did things like they were actually part of the planning for the Bogor Gardens. Also, they started the Zoological Museum of Bogor, which you can see here. For Singapore itself, what we started was basically Logan's Journal, the Journal of the Indian Archipelago and Eastern Asia, which we have the collection here in our library. It doesn't just cover, in fact, there's very little of natural history in it. Where it touches natural history and where I had occasion to use it would be things like gutta percha, pineapple, and so on. But it has interesting things too, like discussion about why Sentosa was called Belakang Mati, and so forth. So there are all these speculations. There's also a lot of geography. Thomson wrote about his Horsburgh's lighthouse. When he did the lighthouse, he published the plans and he described the construction and so on. So there's a lot of information there. My colleague, Ang Xiaoling, actually wrote about the whole journal and so on, which you can see online from our BiblioAsia. Getting closer to home, the Siam Natural History Society is the next one that we can look at. It started 1914 and lasted for about a decade. And fortunately or unfortunately, it was absorbed by what is today the Siam Society. I'd like to read a bit from it. Down here at the bottom part, we hope that each member will do his or her best to assist the journal with contributions. Those who do not feel qualified with a sufficient knowledge of their subject to send in papers can at least forward notes upon the habits of animals and plants or local lists of collections made in different parts of the country. So you can see here the expectation that members would actually contribute to the discussion and the knowledge of the society. So for Singapore, where we start first would be the Singapore Natural History Society and the Singapore Naturalist. It seems to have been inspired by Dr. Gilbert Edward Brooke. Brooke was Chief Health Officer here. Actually, he was Port Officer when the society started, and he went on to become the Chief Health Officer. He was also notably the editor of one of the three editors of the 100 Years of Singapore with Makepeace and Bradel, which is a landmark history of Singapore done at the centenary. He was also quite active in the medical field as the Chief Medical Officer. He also oversaw the expansion of Singapore's quarantine system. So St. John's Island had been set up in the 70s, but by the turn of the century, by the early 20th century, he actually had to supervise the expansion of the system until Singapore's St. John's Island was actually about the biggest quarantine station in the world. And this is a sort of a photo of the deck passengers of their quarantine on St. John's. So you can see here that's the 1880s and that's the early 1900s. So actually there's not much difference in the treatment of deck passengers. Let me clarify that deck passengers are the people who buy passage and they basically live outside on the decks or in the holds. They don't have cabins of their own. The deck passengers, these are the guys with less money. The ones who are Europeans and the wealthy Asians, they would be cabin passengers. They actually have a cabin of their own. Singapore, as part of the empire, became part of this whole arrangement between the different nations to have this universal quarantine system. So basically, they had to systemize things like, if you put a person in quarantine for this reason, how many days do you wait? You don't want a sort of like 3 days in this port, 7 days in there. So basically, they had to hammer out these agreements. He was part of that hammering out, and he was part of the implementation. Besides quarantine, which had a lot to do with cholera, smallpox and other things, but cholera was, I think, the most feared of the lot. He was also had found the time to study basically malaria. There was another scourge that impacted the Europeans, especially here. The other part about the quarantine is the changes, the improvements made were technological. So, for instance, the steam sterilizer, which actually you had to put your clothes, but more importantly, commercial shipments of cloth had to go in and be steamed to kill off everything. Of course, if you're a manufacturer and so on, you start complaining because, of course, it's being steamed. Then after that, you have to dry the stuff. Okay, so this is the first meeting of the Natural History Society, reported in the press. First president was Major John Coney Moulton. He was a curator of the Sarawak Museum in 1909 and basically was pulled over to Singapore. One of his notable distinctions was that he started the Sarawak Museum Journal. So when he came here, he actually was quite systematic and actually started organizing the collections and things which had been, well, I suppose every few decades you need to reorganize and get everything back in order because during the intervening period, basically people dump stuff. What happens is that when you send them specimens, they actually don't process it immediately. They wait until the freezer is full, and then they have a day, they take everything out, and basically defrost everything, and then basically process everything, inject it with formalin or alcohol and so on and so on, and then put everything into the collection. So it may be several weeks or months before they actually, if you send in a specimen, it may take several weeks or months depending on when the freezer gets full. Then you get notified what your specimen was. He was basically more into big mammals, along with a friend of his. Basically, he did mammals of Malaysia, Malaysian ungulates part 1. He never got to do the rest of it because he went to Sarawak as chief secretary. But one thing I'll note is that this photo, and there's another photo of an elephant, it says shot by T.R. Habeck. In case you didn't know, Habeck was the person who actually convinced the sultans to actually make Taman Negara a national park. It was actually King George V national park. And basically, on independence, it became Taman Negara. Just simply that. So he was actually a big game hunter. A reformed big game hunter, maybe, because I suppose he saw the decline in the number of big game around. But it's not that when you say he became reformed, doesn't mean that he stopped hunting and became a vegetarian or anything like that. What these people were advocating was basically responsible hunting and ensuring that there was a habitat for their prey. Now, Major Moulton, actually, the sad part is that he went off to become Chief Secretary of Sarawak, but actually didn't live much longer than that. He actually went for surgery for appendicitis, I believe, and he actually didn't survive the operation. So his career was a bit cut short. Now I'm going to the Singapore Naturalist, the Society's journal. The society started in 1921, and immediately after that, the journal 1922 started. So you can see the link between the idea of a society and a journal, that the two are actually more or less closely related. Much of the material, of course, would be familiar to people today, including, let me go through it, protective coloration and mimicry in insects, Swader, who was basically a herpetologist, list of snakes of Singapore Island. Now the interesting one is this one on the right here, occurrence of the snail Achinta fulica, and basically Jarrett, he's actually talking about the increasing occurrence of what is basically the African giant snail. So here we have basically a report on the early days on when it was starting to spread throughout this area. So in the 1800s, it was basically unknown, and then it basically spread through here. So he's talking about the different reports from different parts of Malaysia of sightings and of it spreading. Also has things that would be of curious interest is that another one was by Abraham, who actually had a little note about how dugong meat is delicious, but only the orang laut could hunt dugong because only they knew the rituals associated with getting the spear ready. Another one would be, another stalwart would be Isaac Henry Burkill. If you don't know who Burkill was, he was a curator at the Botanics, and he basically wrote one of my favorite books, 2-volume Dictionary of the Economic Products of the Malay Peninsula. Basically, if you have to look up the uses and the occurrence of all these, or any plant product especially, basically this is the place to do it. He had something like 16,000 index cards written before he started on this thing, so that's how systematic it was. It took 10 years after his retirement to produce it. After that, he went on to his favorite topic, yams, and worked on yams in Asia. Then after that, still in retirement, he still had time left, so he actually did a history of botany in India. Then he sadly passed away. Other things that in the Singapore Naturalist would be more interesting things like Dr. Brooke, back then, he did a natural history of Shakespeare, looking at the animals and plants in Shakespeare's plays. Other things would be Powell, Cruelty to Animals in Singapore. Basically a discussion about reviving the Society for Protection of Cruelty to Animals, which had lasted through the 1800s, and only stopped because apparently the government stopped giving them the fines. When a person had was convicted, the fine would go to the society, and that's what funded their work. But when the government stopped giving it to them, well, the society died. Now, as I mentioned, Moulton went to Sarawak. So basically, there was his good friend, Reverend George Dexter Allen, actually continued the society and kept it going until 1928. Reverend Dexter Allen is another interesting character because he actually was ordained in the Anglican Church, but he was originally a Moravian. So they were if you were in the 1800s, basically, unless you were Anglican, you couldn't even go to university. What they call the dissenters, the Methodists and other non-Anglicans in England, couldn't go to Oxford or Cambridge. They were actually shut out. But by the time of Reverend Allen, things were more flexible. So you were Moravian, and you basically could actually go and become an Anglican priest. So he actually has a missionary among the Sea Dayaks. And then he basically came over here, and he basically went to different parishes and so on when the regular priest was basically ill or went home on leave, so he basically running around. So he basically became quite well known through the peninsula. And along the way, of course, he was collecting insects because his primary degree was actually not theology. He was actually trained in natural sciences. That's where he graduated in. Another unfortunate part was that this 1928, he caught malaria. He went home, but he caught pneumonia, the flu, and then influenza, and then pneumonia, and passed away. The interesting part is that his wife actually continued here. He was actually at home. He was actually raising funds for St. Andrew's Hospital, and his wife continued to work and actually became president of the Medical Council here in Singapore as well. So you can see that there's a lot of links in the society between natural history members and all these other places. In fact, a lot of them seem to be quite, I would say, burning the candle at both ends, really being active socially and so on. I have not found Allen's entomological insect collection. It's supposed to be with Oxford, actually, but I couldn't find it in the Oxford Museum. As I mentioned, this is Isaac Henry Burkill. Burkill was director of the Botanics after Ridley, so he took over after Ridley. And one interesting part is that the botanical notes apparently were typed out and actually left with the Botanic Gardens. So when we the National Library, actually started doing this digitization program with the Biodiversity Heritage Library. It's an international project dedicated to putting online all the old materials dealing with natural history. So Library of Congress, all the major libraries and so on. So for our part, we're doing a small little part. One of the things that we are putting online would be actually his notes. We've just started and basically we only have the notes from 1912 to 1915 online, but it's quite interesting. So that actually is part of the discussion of his trip around Tioman Islands and the islands around there, Permagil and so on. So he was actually the notes, and actually, as you can see, he also did diagrams. Oh, of course, I forgot that, that another famous personality would be Holtham, who actually was there as well. But let me get on to the Malayan Nature Journal and the Malayan Nature Society. It's quite interesting because the journal came first and the society came later. While it was announced in 1940 that the society had been formed and the journal was out, they never actually met. The reason was that they were in various parts of Malaysia when they formed, and basically it was impossible for them to meet. So basically when they started, it was the Malayan Nature Journal going out to subscribers, and there was never a meeting. The meeting only came 8 years later after the war in 1948. Now the president was Sheber, the chief game warden for the place, based in KL. But the interesting person would be actually the editor of the journal, Mrs. Gladys Lamar. This is from actually the Lamar website. So basically that's them, she and her husband. It's an interesting story that they actually, as I presume, met in Oxford, and basically she went to South Africa to be a teacher. He came here to be to the fisheries department, and then she sailed over in those days. They sailed over and they got married here. The journal is quite typical, so you can take a look later. I've opened it to the part about the interesting part, which would be the Chewong, basically one of the tribes that lived in the Crow area. That's in the north part, the east-west highway crossing to Kelantan. It's along that part. The other ones would be more typical, things like caves, cave formation. So now we'll move on to the Malayan Nature Society, the Singapore branch. And one of the interesting things with the donation of the minute books, and this is the founding meeting, which is on the first page of the first minute book, 1954. So the founding president was Tweedy, but actually Tweedy was retiring. And basically in the next year and so on, they were talking about the farewell dinner for Tweedy. The person who was writing all this was Ivan Enoch. He was actually very diligent in that what it seems to be every single outing has an entry. So every month, every outing, where they went, Bedok, to the Bedok seashore, to the swamp, so on and so on, everything had an entry. Now, the one interesting part, if you look at the names on the thing, would be they are all actually with the, and this would be the tradition, they would be actually with the museum, the university, or the botanics. The one notable part would be Lok Wan To, which is, I suppose if you think about it, quite strange. He's an Asian. He's not, the rest are professionals, educated with degrees in the topic. He's basically just, I believe he read literature and he's a businessman, which is quite an interesting difference. But apparently, from reading about Lok Wan To, he actually sort of like grew up kind of loving nature, and he got interested in photography. During the war, he escaped from Singapore, but he was injured, and basically while recovering, he was introduced to the legendary Salim Ali. Salim Ali is seen as the father of Indian ornithology. He basically is a living legend, and they went on a trip out. And it's quite interesting if you read the Lok Wan To's Birds. It's a piece about how Salim Ali, it was quite obvious he was not used to these privations, but he seemed to have borne it without complaint, except that the part about the local water. So he was constantly suffering from diarrhea, which was, I think, the most challenging part of it. And Salim Ali writes that he had no idea then that this guy was quite wealthy. They started a lifelong friendship, and basically, Salim Salih car was actually given to him by Lok Wan Tho. So he was actually quite generous and I believe the family, not just Lok, but the sister and so on, the relatives and descendants, actually have been quite generous and supportive of natural history causes. Now, how mad was Lok Wan Tho about birds? Well, basically, this is Malcolm McDonald's garden in Johor. He basically had this horrendously tall tower built. It must have been quite stable because he went up there regularly to photograph the nest. But so basically you can see also that the connections that are available to the society through Lok Wan Tho and through the others. And in fact, as I mentioned, he was quite generous. He also basically for screenings and for meetings down in town, he loaned them the Odeon Cinema and the Hollywood film. So you'll have screenings of things like beavers and so on, or Western peries and so on, as well as your local. In later years, there were actually local movies made by BBC and other crews, and basically they will get the screening as well there. So this is from 1954, Kuo Shang Wei photograph of Odeon Cinema from our Picture SG collection. Now, he also actually, if you read the whole thing, there's actually involved in several other things. He was also things like today the what is called the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. Back then, they for the protection of natural resources and so on. So he basically was also one of those that was pushing for membership and getting the government to join with IUCN. And because he was so into birds, basically he was the one who got the Nature Society involved in what is today BirdLife International. Okay, so you can see that the international links actually came out partially through him, rather than through the Europeans on the committee. So this one I thought was very poignant. It was a letter I found inside the donation. It's a request for a leave of absence from Lok Wan Tho, dated 1st April 1964. After this, about 2 months later, he actually died in a plane crash in Taiwan. And this is the Tweedy, the first president. He was curator of the Raffles Museum, and quite a bit of the collection is his. And this is when they actually, the Raffles Museum collection of natural history specimens actually finds a home at NUS. He was actually very much an educator. He started with poisonous animals of Malaya, at the same time giving a set of radio talks, which were published after the war by Donald Moore, radio naturalist. He also he had a lot of these little publications that were targeted at lay people. So he was very much an educator and very enthusiastic about promoting it to laymen. So you can see sort of where why he was so active in the society, even though it was only for a short few years. Now, as I was saying, I was interested in about becoming local, or as the how they called it in those days, Malayanization. So I looked at all the people in the first few years of the society's history. So you can see here at the start, Lok Wan Tho is the only name. Then you'll see continuing until 1958-59, Tevata's son, I hope I'm getting his name right, actually is invited to come in. He's actually he's a doctor and actually quite active socially with things like the Rotary Club and so on. So he lasts for a few years. And the other person that's co-opted, not elected, is actually Lee Seng Tee. The interesting part is that there's an address attached to it. It's Lee Rubber. So actually, he's a son of the Lee Kong Chian. So basically, he was also active with the society. Interestingly, actually, this totally unrelated. He also donated an entire hall to one of the colleges in Cambridge. There's a pineapple hall and one of the small colleges just on the fringes of the Cambridge town. So, and there's actually a library named after him as well in that same college. Anyway, so these are the sort of characters. The other one that's interesting is 1959 is S.Y. Han. Why he's interesting is because in 1958, he actually is the convener for the junior branch of the section of the society. Other people then appear would be Professor Avadani, who actually kept a lot of the materials and basically is the reason why they've been preserved. And the other one would be that appears in 1960 because he got hired as a marine biologist with the university, is Roland Eric Sharma. Now, Sharma has a interesting thing. He's from Ipoh. Then he went to the UK to study. And along the way, he worked at, I believe, Aberdeen in the fisheries, the marine department. And then basically he got this opportunity to join with two other guys to basically sail the Atlantic in a yacht. And basically his job was basically, he and his thing was to basically take marine specimens, basically fish and everything else along the way. So they sailed down to Africa, and then they drifted across the Atlantic to the Caribbean. So that was an 80-odd day journey. And that made the headlines around the world. So this is from the Keystone Press Agency, this photograph just before they set off from England. This is Prof. Avadani. He was here just earlier this year at the Donor Appreciation Night. If you look at the 1959, the chairman is Desmond Johnson and the secretary is Anne Johnson. They are husband and wife team. Desmond Johnson and Anne Johnson, they were actually also part of the group that actually pushed to save the Raffles Museum specimens. The interesting part is that Anne wasn't with NUS, she was with Nanta. And when Ananta was merged into NUS, she moved on. When she moved on, she actually became elder and then pastor with the Orchard Road Presbyterian Church, and then went on to write history of the Presbyterian Church in Singapore by the title of The Burning Bush. So that's her from the back of the Burning Bush book. The other one actually who's also quite a figure in the society would be A.N. Rao. Dr. Rao, in his other life, actually was a Hindu and started the Hindu Center because he and a few others felt that basically people were doing the rituals without understanding. So the Hindu Center was meant to help educate Hindus in actually, especially the younger ones, in what the reason was for what they were doing. This is the earliest set of events, the news, what we would call today the newsletter. Basically, it's just a diary of events and basically a sort of activities, which is quite interesting. It's quite similar to what we have today in Nature Society. Interesting part was below that was an important notice about the Aqualang diving class. It seems to be the first, the introduction to diving. In fact, for diving in Singapore, this is about the earliest, and it's actually because of the lack of equipment. They were doing it at the naval base. So the Navy was actually graciously helping them. It looks like it was organized by Roland Sharma. Again, he's a marine biologist, so that sort of explains why he was involved in having this group of people learning diving. Now, the interesting part was, this notice was because some annoyance has been caused to our kind friends in the Navy by applications from unauthorized people, not even known to the Marine Study Group or to the committee, not genuine members of the society and totally uninterested in marine nature study and not even able to swim, but expecting to be taught swimming as well as diving. This notice was actually sort of to warn people off from telling friends about it and getting all these nuisance calls. I really pity whoever is the receptionist in the naval base. The other part from the 80s is for those who have done editing work in the 80s and so on, and basically were students. This was how we used to do illustrations for the newsletter and so on, the cheap way. So basically, we use some Scotch tape, and then basically you Scotch taped on the illustrations, photocopy, voila, you have an illustrated newsletter. Of course, these days you just use your Word or your software, and you just basically cut and paste, no trace of the Scotch tape needed. So far, I've been talking about the more study part, the very hobby type part of the society. There's another part which is basically what we call the advocacy, the very explicitly civil society part of the group. Now, the idea of the conservation of nature and the modern part would actually begin really with John Muir and the Sierra Club in their campaign to protect Yosemite National Park. The park had already had protection status, but the thing is that in the 1800s, the idea of a park was not to appreciate nature and so on, but because it's a wonder to be admired. So you would get tourists in there, they would just go in and look, and basically then you would get your hotels and so on and so forth, your luxuries, and I suppose your casino, that sort of thing. So basically that was the idea of a park. Okay, there was no real appreciation past the first few minutes, I suppose. So that Yosemite National Park, they had this whole bunch of people in San Francisco and the area around who basically banded together and campaigned to stop it being exploited because it was under pressure, not just from, I suppose, travel industry but also by things like logging, ranchers wanting to use it, Hetch Hetchy, they wanted to build a reservoir there and so on. So they started this concern, and this is I suppose, the founding of the modern environmental movement. This was seems to have been the case also with the Malayan Nature Society Singapore branch. First campaign was basically Ulu Pandan Nature Reserve, one of the 3 nature reserves along with Kranji and Bukit Timah, designated in 1951, increased protection. There was already protections before, but this was basically explicit. However, there was pressure in the late 50s, 56 onwards, for it to be used for prawn farming. In this, you would see that Lok Wan Tho was actually unofficially brokering meetings and discussions with Joman Boy, who was the minister for the economic development, and also with the chief minister Lim Yew Hock. So there's all these negotiations going on. In the end, a compromise was reached in which that as part of the reserve was kept, and then the rest was released for prawn farms. However, if you know where Ulu Pandan is, it's smack in the middle of Jurong. So 1962, whole place got developed. But so this was I would call this the first campaign. But again, it's never mentioned explicitly in the press that it's the Malayan Nature Society Singapore branch. They just talk about conservationists, and they talk about moderate conservationists and radical conservationists and negotiating with them. So there's no reference in it. As I mentioned, the junior section in 22nd September 1958, it's at the end of the first book. It's the inaugural meeting, but you basically convene the first meeting of the junior branch. Their activities basically were actually geared to attract students and also schools. So basically, it was an explicit move to educate the younger generation. Now I'll skip on to another interesting part, which is the 1977 sewage sludge treatment works. Those who are bird watchers and those who live in the northeast part of Singapore, you'll recognize the name there is on the right hand, the map. It's Lorong Halus. Okay, so the sludge treatment works there and so on. There was like basically they were trying out things like bird ringing and so on. You may know the author. He may have delivered you if you're one of the younger people in the room. He's actually Dr. Ng Sun Chai. He's obs and gynae. He's basically just finishing his medical education at the time. So this was his little contribution. And he has a lot of stories about bird ringing and so on, which if you know him, you can actually get him to tell you about all the adventures of him when he was younger. I think he's still out in the field. Okay, then the other part which happened in the 80s would be, of course, Sungai Buloh, which just actually had a celebration and a surprise announcement of Mandai mudflats being included. Now, in early 1980s, a bird watcher, Richard Hale, actually discovered the area was rich in migratory birds. And then he contacted the Nature Society, and basically there was this whole campaign then to actually have it conserved. So it has, of course, by the fact that it's actually celebrating basically an expansion, obviously the campaign succeeded. Back to publishing, during this period was also when they started publishing Singapore Avifauna and the Pangolin, which are basically records of the bird life and the non-bird life. Well, the mammals, the reptiles, the amphibians, and the fishes. In one and the other. The editor for the first one, Avifauna, was Lim Kim Sing, and the other one is Ho Hua Chu. All these people and more of them, they were basically part of this whole newer, younger generation. There was actually more part of that campaign for Sungai Buloh. Then I put in this because it seems that a lot of people, there's this massive scientific research expedition which MNS, Malayan Nature Society, participated in 85-86, which if you look at the back of this Endau, the book published after the expedition, Endau Rompin, a lot of Singapore members participated in. So this was basically a very seems to have been a landmark event. In fact, you'll see that in the book, you'll see a lot of comments and so on by Singapore members. Now, this is about the change in the society as well, because right after this, you get the Singapore branch finally has its Merdeka movement. So then they finally split off. And immediately after splitting off, comes this, in 1991, comes this surprise from the government of developing the Lower Pierce into a golf course. It's a surprise because because the land is actually already gazetted. It's so that you would have to de-gazette it, and basically, so you're developing a golf course on what is already land with a purpose. So basically, this ended up with a huge outcry, and I suppose that's when people see this as the start of advocacy by the Nature Society. But this is actually, it's only because it's a surprise and because it's a sudden thing. So therefore, you end up with this conflict that happens, whereas all the other previous ones, they're all very gradual and a lot of meetings and negotiations. Okay, now we get on. I'm not surprised that just after all this, basically Nature Society Singapore now starts a magazine of its own, Nature Watch. In the past, of course, they would have depended on the Journal of the Malaysian Journal, but now because it's separate, it has started its own. I'm not going to go into the more recent history, but it starts with a lot of different subgroups. And one of these more interesting ones would be the Jalan Hijau subgroup, which was basically a venture into brown issues, recycling, environmental issues. But it only lasted about less than a decade. Cynthia Wee Hofer was the founder of the group. She brought the people together. Then it was actually moved on. Things like animal rights issues and so on. So they were actually trying and so on. But then the group sort of petered out later in the 90s. There are many groups sprouting up in today, both online and in a lot of them are unregistered. They don't see the need to register. But basically, one of the ones I want to point out is basically one associated with the Raffles Museum, NUS Toddy Cats. So basically, they actually are a separate part and mostly undergraduates and graduates of the zoology department, and basically they're centered around the museum. So there you can see that this is a continuing thing, that it's not a case where a society sort of dominates it, but you can see the things are all branching out. Anyways, I think that's about it. I will now like to invite questions from the thing.
Thank you, Tim. Let's give Tim a round of applause.
Hi, my name's Azra. I am actually a member of the Malayan Nature Society Singapore, and in fact when I first joined, it was still called the Malayan Nature Society. And as members, we were all extremely traumatized when I remember we had to make the decision on breaking with the Malayan Nature Society because, we felt a strong connection with them. Never mind politics, but, there was a lot of shared interests. So it was a very painful decision, I remember, when the decision was actually made to break with the name Malayan Nature Society. Anyway, never mind, sorry about that. My question actually is, your presentation talks a lot about older books and publications produced, quite some time ago. I'm looking sometimes also for new publications, things that in the naturalist and the nature field that have taken place in the last, say, 10 or 20 years. What do you see as a trend in that? Are there new publications coming out? Is this an area where we think we should do something to encourage more publications?
I may be a librarian, but I'm going to be neutral about encouraging more publications. But I will note that there are a lot of new publications, but increasingly, you are looking at publications going online. So the library itself, we are actually, just had legislation to start allowing us to collect online materials from websites, blogs, and the thing, as long as they're Singapore. So for instance, I think there's if you remember, I was talking about where they were saying that if you can't write a full paper, at least you can provide observations. There are now online avenues where there are sort of online papers, and some of these are later, they collect the papers together and publish them as a book. So there is that sort of publication and so on going on, but it's becoming, it's a different world that's evolving.
Hi, Tim. I just wanted to ask you, when I was very young, I was brought to the National Museum, and I remember that part of the nature collection were also tribes, human tribes and things. The documentation, are there any books in your collection that can show that? I'm interested in the role of man as part of...
Yes, a lot of these, as you can see from the Che Wong and so on, the local journals like the Jambras and so on, they actually, the Royal Asiatic Society here, actually did publish anthropological stuff. Also, likewise, the publications for a lot of these officials and so on, when they went into the field to become governors and so on, they would actually publish little monographs and the thing, and we would have them because often the publication would be done here. So yes, there is a collection of anthropological material for the region.
Hi, I'm Angeline. Question about Alfred Wallace.
Okay.
How much influence did he have on the people who formed the earliest nature society groups?
Wallace was, I think, about several decades, because the Moulton and so on, that's like in the start of the 1900s, whereas Wallace was mid-1800s. So really the influence would be through his books rather than through any sort of personal contact. You must remember, of course, that Wallace, he came here, he collected, and he went home. Likewise, Moulton and these guys, they were basically employed by the government, came here, served their stint, and if they survived, went home. With the exception, I will say, of Gilbert Brooke, which I didn't mention. He actually loved Singapore. So that after his retirement, he actually went to Penang Hill and actually lived there until he passed away in, I think, Singapore General Hospital. He took ill and then he basically sailed here to get treatment and he passed away. So basically, with a few notable exceptions who sort of, I suppose, became Singaporeans. So their influence would be, as undergraduates, they would have studied and maybe passed the bust of Wallace in the university, and that would be more the part of it, not through this part of the world.
Hi, Tim. I noticed there's other books that dated 19th century. You want to explain a little bit more why they are on display?
Oh, okay. These are the other materials in our rare collection that are actually from before. So people like Bleecker, Distant, and so on, they are quite authoritative books in our collection on natural history. And they are also, I suppose, all people involved in natural history, they are quite a bit eccentric in their own right. So all of them actually have their own stories to tell. Distant just sailed here, basically got a job on a ship and sailed here to do collecting. So all these people basically have their obsessions and so on to actually come here and study. To quote Avadani, it's like, this place is like teeming with different species and different life, unlike other places of the world, which are sort of like you get only one species of each genus in your area, and that's it. Whereas down here, it's like identification is a nightmare sometimes. 6 species, and they all look very similar, but they all fit different habitats.
All right, on that note, let's thank Timothy again for the wonderful sharing.